The Raijintek Orcus Core 360 is a new all-in-one liquid CPU cooler that does not follow the usual path that we have seen with many liquid CPU coolers. The Orcus series uses an inline pump to move the liquid around the loop. The Orcus Core 360, not to be mistaken with the regular Raijintek Orcus 360 cooler, is a cut-down version of the before-mentioned cooler. The Core edition has only the cooler and its mounting system, and that's it. There are no fans included with this cooler, nor any fan splitter or RGB adapters or addressable RGB hub. The Orcus Core 360 is obviously cheaper than its fully equipped counterpart and leaves you with the choice of what fans to use and how many to use. The Raijintek Orcus Core 360 is available for around $80 or euros, depending on what retailer you use. And let me tell you this, you will have to shop around to get this cooler for the right price, because at the moment of this review, the pricing is all over the place. Some retailers have this cooler listed for $80 or euros, while others go as high as $120 or euros. The highlight of the Orcus Core 360 is obviously the inline pump, which is similar in design with the pump used on the Be Quiet Pure Loop series. And that's a great first sign, as the Be Quiet Pure Loop coolers are one of the best around, especially in terms of the low noise operation for the pumps. The design of the Orcus Core 360 is simple, with the showpiece of the CPU cooler located on the CPU block. This white thing is actually a flow meter, which is often used on custom liquid cooling loops, to not only measure the flow of the coolant, but also to have a visual reference of the coolant moving around the loop. And it's a nice feature to see. It has a lovely smooth motion. However, you may ask yourself why it's not RGB illuminated, even though it has RGB LEDs inside. Good question, glad you asked, because here is the first thing that needs to be addressed. You see, there are RGB LEDs inside the CPU block. The cooler is advertised with RGB inside the CPU block, and you have a cable and a connector to power and control the LEDs. However, the connector used here is proprietary and only works with an RGB compatible hub. So you can connect this to your motherboard directly or to a simple RGB controller. You must have the RGB hub, and I do not have it, so no RGB for me. This is an oversight to what is in essence a really good design idea. Another great feature found on the Orcus Core 360 is that on the side of the CPU block it has a fully fledged drain plug, made out of metal no less. This is great to see, especially since included in the package you get a full bottle of clear coolant, so you can top up your CPU cooler in the future. The base plate of the CPU cooler is made from solid copper, which is also nickel plated for increased durability and for this lovely silver shining surface. The CPU block has two angle fittings that can swivel to accommodate for the curvature of the tubes once the cooler is installed in a system. This is good to see. However, as is the usual these days, these fittings are not made out of metal, but instead are made out of plain, good quality plastic. The tubes used with this cooler have an inner diameter of 5mm and an outer diameter of 10.6mm, with a length of 350mm. These tubes are also fortunately covered by a high quality synthetic sleeving, which has a woven texture and a bit of a reflection as well. And on the tubes is the pump of the cooler, a simple inline pump which uses a ceramic axis and is capable of delivering up to 66 liters of liquid per hour. By default, this pump will spin at around 5000 RPM, but that will not be an issue noise-wise, as these inline pumps are very quiet, but more on that later on into the review. Please keep in mind that these pumps require constant 12 volts of power, so do not just connect them to your motherboard and expect them to work at their best, because they won't. The tubes continue down to the cooler and link to the radiator. The connection between the tubing and the radiator is done through some fixed plastic fittings. Speaking of the radiator, in the case of the Orcus Core 360, this radiator has a length of 395mm, a width of 120mm and a thickness of 38mm. Other than that, this radiator looks to be pretty simple in terms of its construction, with a mostly aluminum body and cooling fins. Before we test this cooler, it's time to see what's included with it, and we start with the bottle that includes a clear coolant, a user manual, a plastic thermal compound spreader, and the components of the mounting system, which include metallic nuts, plastic spacers, short and long bolts alongside two metallic plates. The one that has foam around one of its sides is the actual backplate of the cooler. The mounting system components are packaged in this plastic tray, which not only will protect them during shipping, but it will also keep them in one place. The installation process is very simple. You first take the backplate and insert those long screws into it. Afterwards, you place the backplate at the back of the motherboard with the foam side facing the motherboard. Then you place the plastic washers over the screws on the front side of the motherboard, and afterwards you attach these metallic nuts over the washers. Keep in mind that you need to attach these nuts with the flat side facing towards the motherboard, so this hollowed out side faces up. Afterwards, you place the second plate over the nuts and secure it with the small screws. Finally, you apply the thermal compound and place the CPU block over the CPU and the metallic plate. You then secure the CPU block in place with these two thumb screws, and you're pretty much done. As this is the core version of the Raijintek Orcus 360, there are no fans included. Thus, I decided to use three 120mm Silverstone Air Blazer RGB fans. I've opted for these fans as are what most users will most likely get. Their price is pretty good, have RGB and can deliver a good static pressure and airflow, albeit with a higher noise output. Before we see how good the cooling is with the Raijintek Orcus Core 360, we need to hear how it sounds like. And you will get to hear an actual noise sample of the cooler installed in the testing system. As this is a liquid CPU cooler, we will start with a pump noise sample. I am doing this because while a decibel reading for the noise output is useful, it will not take into account and paint the complete picture of the sound of the coolers, as it cannot pick up unwanted noises such as the pump or bearing ticking of the fans. And this is why the inline pumps, while they might not look that great, they do make up with a very low noise output. Keep in mind that this is with the side panel of the case open and the microphone placed at roughly 5 cm away from the system. And the noise of the fans, well, keep in mind that this is with the Silverstone fans, which are not included, so your mileage will absolutely vary, depending on which fans you choose. With the three Silverstone fans pushing for their maximum speed of 2200 RPM, the cooler reached a maximum noise output of 48 decibels, reached with the measuring device placed at a distance of 10 cm away from the system and the CPU cooler. This noise output was expected as these fans are spinning at over 2000 RPM and can push a lot of air. Of course, you can always use better fans or at least fans that spin slower, but that is up to you. Testing each CPU cooler is done with an Intel i9 9900K CPU running at both its factory frequency and settings, and then overclocked manually to 5 GHz on all cores. The ambient temperature is fixed at 26 degrees Celsius, and two benchmarks will be used to test the cooling performance of each CPU cooler. We start with Intel Burn Test V2, a synthetic benchmark which places a load onto the CPU that is similar in severity with what you will encounter while playing a modern AAA video game. And in this test, the Raijintek Orcus Core 360 with the Silverstone Air Blazer 120 fans reached a maximum temperature of 56 degrees Celsius with the CPU overclock, which places this CPU cooler on the second position in our graphs. However, the next test is where each CPU cooler will be pushed to its limits, as this test is using the FPU stability test of the AIDA 64 Extreme software. This synthetic benchmark places an unrealistically high load on the CPU, something which you will never encounter in your daily usage, unless of course you are rendering videos using the CPU as the only rendering unit. And in this test, the Raijintek Orcus Core 360 with the Silverstone Air Blazer 120 fans reached a maximum temperature of 82 degrees Celsius, which makes the Raijintek Orcus Core 360 the second best CPU cooler I've ever tested so far. The Raijintek Orcus Core 360 is a really good CPU cooler, both in terms of the actual cooling performance and also in terms of the build quality. Although the CPU block and the pump are made from plastic, more or less, it's the kind of plastic that will not break if you look at it for too long. Not only that, but the tubes and the radiator are well made, and the same can be said for the mounting system, which uses mostly metal components. Speaking of which, the mounting system is very easy to understand and to use. However, the user manual could have been better, especially since it's printed on a small font. The cooling performance is great, however, this being the core version of the cooler, this performance will vary based on what fans you use, as you can get a good cooling performance if you just use high-speed fans, but lose a lot in terms of the noise output. One advantage that the Raijintek Orcus Core 360 has is the inline pump, which is very quiet even when it's spinning at its maximum rated speed of 5000 RPM. This is something that many CPU coolers on the market still struggle with, especially those based on the standard Raijintek design. The design itself is good. The flow meter installed inside the CPU block is certainly an appealing thing, and I'm sure that it would look even better with some RGB illumination, which it has. But it uses a non-standard connector, which adds an issue to solve, an issue that shouldn't have existed in the first place. It's not a bad thing by any means, it doesn't affect the look of this cooler that much, but to not include an adapter at least for the RGB LEDs is a bit of a letdown. The Raijintek Orcus Core 360 is good, and if you can find it for a good price and pair it with a good set of fans, it can make for a great CPU cooler, both in terms of the cooling and the low noise output. And that's the charm of the Core series. It's up to you to make it what you want. The base performance is there, but you will make it the cooler that you need it to be. If you like this review, then you might consider subscribing for more, and also if you want to support the channel in a direct way, then in the description below you will find the links for both the Patreon and the Subscriber Star pages of this channel.